The morning the insult was carved into her life forever, Eliza stood in the kitchen of her father's farmhouse with hands raw from scrubbing. She had risen before dawn, as always, to knead bread and milk the cows, yet still her father's voice thundered across the room heavy with disgust. "Useless!" he spat, slamming his fist on the table. "A girl of 18, still unwed, still nothing to show for her keep. A burden, that's what you are." Eliza lowered her eyes to the worn floorboards, heart hammering. She had heard the words before, whispered, muttered, or hissed behind her back, but today they carried a sharper edge. Her brothers smirked from the doorway, their arms crossed in smug satisfaction. They had wives who bore children and cooked their meals. By comparison, Eliza's place in the family was like that of an unwanted stray. Her mother said nothing, only stirred the pot on the stove with eyes fixed on the simmering broth, pretending deafness. Silence was her mother's way of surviving her husband's rages. Eliza longed to slip into that same silence, but she had no such shield. "I can work harder," she whispered, gripping her apron with trembling hands. "I can—" "No harder than a mule," her father cut in. "And a mule earns its keep. You don't. You're worth less than the feed it takes to keep you alive." The words struck like blows, each one leaving a bruise unseen. She wanted to shout, to tell him that she had given all she could, that she'd kept the house, tended the garden, mended clothes, and done everything asked of her. But her voice choked in her throat. Defiance would only worsen her lot. That evening she learned how deep her father's scorn reached. A trader stopped at their farm, a rough man with sharp eyes and a cart of goods. Eliza carried out a tray of cider for him, only to realize, too, late, that her father's glance at her was not one of dismissal but of calculation. "This one," her father said, jerking his thumb toward her, "she's no good to us, but she can cook and she's strong. You take her off my hands for a fair price, and she'll work for you well enough." Eliza froze, the tray rattling in her hands. Surely he didn't mean it. Surely he wouldn't, but the trader grinned, revealing teeth yellowed with tobacco. "What's her price?" Her father named a sum so pitifully small it burned hotter than any insult before. Less than the cost of a mule, indeed. In that moment, Eliza realized she wasn't a daughter in his eyes at all, but a weight to be bargained away. Her mother said nothing. Her brothers laughed under their breath, and Eliza, powerless to resist, stood still as the bargain was struck. The trader pressed coins into her father's hand, and her fate was sealed. That night, she lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The word worthless echoed in her mind like a brand seared into her skin. Tomorrow, she would be gone. Sold. Like cattle cast off by the very blood that should have sheltered her. Yet beneath her despair flickered the faintest ember of something else. Something fragile, unspoken, and nearly extinguished. The hope that perhaps, beyond the reach of her father's cruelty, life might still hold a corner of mercy. She did not yet know that a lonely mountain man would be the one to kindle that ember into a flame. The journey to the mountain town was a blur of rutted roads and cold wind. Eliza sat in the back of the trader's wagon, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white against her faded dress. Every jolt of the wheels reminded her that she was no longer a daughter, no longer part of a family. She was property now, something bought, something to be sold again. The trader hardly spoke to her. When he did, it was with the same tone a man might use for his mule. "Sit quiet. Don't make trouble." His words were clipped, his eyes already measuring what profit he might gain by reselling her. By the time they reached town, dusk was falling. The place was rough and raw, perched on the edge of wilderness where mountains rose like black teeth against the horizon. A handful of wooden buildings huddled along the main street: saloon, mercantile, blacksmith, boarding house. The scent of smoke and whiskey clung to the air. The trader wasted no time. He led Eliza to the saloon, its doors swinging wide to a haze of tobacco smoke and the low rumble of men's voices. The moment she stepped inside, heads turned. A hush fell over the room, and she felt every eye rake across her form. Some gazes were appraising, others mocking, a few hungrier than she cared to imagine. "She's strong, can cook, and won't cost you much," the trader announced, shoving her forward a step as though she were a prize hog. "Any man here could use an extra pair of hands." Laughter rippled through the room. One man, broad-shouldered, red-faced, with a prospector's cap perched askew, whistled low. "What's the asking price?" The trader named a figure, one that made Eliza's stomach twist. It was less than what her father had demanded for an old cow last spring. The prospector slapped a hand against the bar. "I'll take her. Strong back, young enough. Don't need more than that." His eyes lingered on her in a way that made her shrink inside herself. A rough murmur of agreement spread among the men. Some laughed, others muttered about getting their turn if the prospector grew tired of her. Heat crawled up Eliza's neck, shame searing deeper than any wound. She kept her head down, fighting tears, praying someone, anyone, would end this humiliation quickly. That was when she noticed him. He sat alone in the far corner, a tall man with weather-lined features and a beard that shadowed his jaw. His clothes were plain, worn from hard use, but clean. Unlike the others, he didn't leer or laugh. He studied her quietly, his eyes steady. Gray, she thought, though it was hard to tell in the dim lamplight. When the prospector reached into his pocket for coins, the man in the corner rose. His chair scraped against the floorboards, and the saloon stilled as he crossed the room with measured steps. "I'll pay," he said simply, his voice low but carrying. He laid silver dollars on the bar without haggling, more than what the trader had asked. The coins gleamed under the lamplight, silencing any protest. The prospector scowled. "What's she to you, Caleb? You ain't needed a woman in all the years you've been holed up on that mountain." The man, Caleb, they called him, met the prospector's stare with a calm that carried weight. "What she is to me is none of your concern." He turned then, and for the first time his gaze met Eliza's. There was no hunger in it, no mockery. Only something she couldn't name, respect, perhaps, or pity, but threaded with a quiet strength that steadied her trembling heart. Without another word, Caleb tipped his hat to the trader, then to Eliza. "Come on. You're with me now." Her feet moved before her mind caught up. For the first time since her father sold her, she felt the smallest flicker of relief. She didn't know what kind of man Caleb was or what awaited her in the mountains, but anything was better than being bought by a brute who saw her as nothing more than a tool. And as the saloon door swung shut behind them, she dared to wonder if her life had not ended after all, but only begun. The cold night air struck Eliza's cheeks as the saloon doors closed behind her. For a moment she stood there stunned, her heart hammering. The trader pocketed his coins and vanished into the crowd without so much as a backward glance. He had sold her, and she no longer belonged to him. Now she followed the tall stranger who had spoken so few words, but carried himself with a calm certainty. Caleb led her to where two horses waited near the hitching post. One was a sturdy bay gelding, the other a chestnut mare with a gentle eye. Without speaking, he loosened the mare's reins and placed them in Eliza's hand. She hesitated, uncertain if she had the right even to touch the animal, but Caleb gave a small nod. "She's yours to ride. Treat her kindly and she'll take care of you." The words startled her. Yours to ride. Not mine, not his. For the first time that day, someone had handed her something not as a command, but as a gift. She stroked the mare's muzzle, her throat tightening. Caleb mounted his gelding with an ease that came from years in the saddle. He waited as Eliza clumsily arranged her skirts and tried to pull herself up. Her first attempt nearly ended with her sliding back down, but Caleb reached over, steadying her with one strong hand. He didn't laugh, didn't scold, just gave her the balance she needed until she settled in the saddle. The town's dim lights faded quickly as they left the main street. Soon the mountains loomed larger, their shadows stretching long and deep. The trail climbed steadily, winding past rocky outcrops and through whispering pines. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves on dirt and the distant cry of an owl. At first, Eliza was afraid of the silence. All her life she had lived among voices, harsh ones, to be sure, but constant. Here the hush pressed in, heavy and strange. Yet as the hours passed, it began to soothe her. The rhythm of the mare's gait steadied her heartbeat, and the clean air filled her lungs with something close to relief. Now and again, Caleb spoke. Not with idle chatter, but with words that mattered. "Trail's rough ahead. Hold the reins tighter." Or, "There's a stream up yonder. We'll stop to water the horses." His voice was steady, like the earth itself, and never sharp. She found herself listening intently, not out of fear of punishment, but because his words carried weight. When they paused by the stream, Caleb knelt to fill a tin cup and handed it to her before drinking himself. Eliza stared at the cup, astonished. No man had ever served her before, not her father, not her brothers. It was a simple thing, water passed from hand to hand, but it unraveled a knot in her chest she hadn't realized was there. As the ride stretched into the night, fatigue set in. Her legs ached, her back throbbed, and her eyelids grew heavy. Caleb noticed, of course. He slowed the pace, guiding her mare closer to his gelding so that if she swayed, he could catch her. She wondered how he could be so watchful without a single word of complaint. At last, near midnight, a faint glow appeared high on the ridge, the promise of firelight. Relief flooded her. Somewhere up ahead, a roof and 4 walls waited, not a strange bunkhouse or a prospector's tent, but his home. Eliza stole a glance at Caleb as they rode. His face was etched with shadows, unreadable, but there was no cruelty there. He seemed carved from the very mountains themselves, strong, unyielding, solitary, and she, sold like livestock only hours before, found herself daring to hope that maybe, just maybe, she was being led into a life she had not thought possible. By the time Eliza and Caleb reached the ridge, dawn had begun to creep across the sky. The blackness softened to gray, and the first pale streaks of gold brushed the jagged mountain peaks. Eliza was bone-weary, her body aching from the long ride. But when she caught her first glimpse of his home, her breath caught in her throat. The cabin stood sturdy against the edge of the ridge, built from thick logs darkened by time and weather. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, carrying the promise of warmth and food. Around it stretched a clearing, small fields neatly carved from the wild earth, a barn slouched but strong, and a garden fenced with care. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, and in that moment it looked to Eliza like a fortress against the cruel world she had known. Caleb swung easily down from his horse and came to help her dismount. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground, nearly giving out after the long hours in the saddle. Caleb's steady hand caught her elbow. "Careful," he murmured. "No rebuke, no sharpness, just quiet steadiness." He led her to the cabin and pushed open the door. Eliza stepped inside, expecting little more than rough boards and shadows, but what she found surprised her. The room was plain but warm, the scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. A hearth glowed faintly with embers. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with jars of dried herbs and food. A thick bearskin rug lay near the fire, and a rough-hewn table sat beneath a narrow window. It wasn't a palace, but it was a home. A place someone had built with his own 2 hands and a measure of pride. "You can rest here," Caleb said, setting down a pack he'd carried. "The bed's in that corner. You'll be safe." The words twisted in her chest. Safe. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had said that to her. Certainly not her father, who had called her worthless. Not her brothers, who had sneered at her clumsy hands. Safety had been a dream too distant to reach. And here stood a man, a stranger still, offering it so simply, as if it were no more unusual than offering bread. Eliza drifted toward the bed he indicated. It was small but neatly made, a quilt spread across it in careful squares of fabric. She touched it gently, feeling the stitches beneath her fingers. Someone had sewn this with patience. She wondered if it had been Caleb's late wife. "Sit," Caleb said. "I'll fix you something to eat." Her stomach clenched with both hunger and confusion. Men in her life had always expected to be served, never to serve. She sank onto the edge of the bed, watching as he moved about the cabin. He wasn't graceful, his motions were practical, efficient. But there was something strangely comforting in the way he stirred the embers back to life and set a kettle over the fire. When he placed a bowl of hot broth in her hands, Eliza nearly wept. The steam rose warm against her face, the scent rich with herbs. "Thank you," she whispered, the words awkward on her lips. Gratitude was something she rarely had cause to express. Caleb gave a simple nod and sat across the room, giving her space as she ate. He didn't press her with questions or commands. He simply let her be. For the first time in her life, Eliza felt the sharp edges of fear begin to soften. She didn't know what Caleb wanted from her, or if he wanted anything at all, but here, in this cabin on the ridge, with a fire warming her and a quilt waiting, she felt a fragile flicker of belonging, and as she finished the last sip of broth, she realized something that startled her more than all else. For the first time since she had been sold, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Eliza woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood. For a moment, she lay still beneath the quilt, disoriented by the unfamiliar bed and the warmth of the cabin. Then she remembered the traitor, the saloon, the stranger who had taken her away. Caleb. The memory sent a rush of relief through her chest. She rose quietly, smoothing her tangled hair with her fingers, and peered out the window. There he was, standing in the yard, sleeves rolled up as he swung the axe with steady rhythm. Each strike was powerful but controlled, and the wood split clean under his hands. His movements weren't those of a man showing off, but of one who had done this work countless times in silence. Eliza's gaze lingered, not on his strength, but on the loneliness in his stance. He carried himself like a man who bore weight heavier than wood. Later, when he returned inside with an armload of kindling, she noticed the small things, the way his eyes avoided hers, the faint stiffness in his shoulders, the scars along his forearms that looked old but hard-earned. He seemed to expect nothing from her, only to carry on with his day as though her presence didn't disturb the order of his life. "You can rest," he told her, as he set the kindling near the hearth. "Or if you'd rather keep busy, there's bread and flour in the pantry. Do what you're used to." It wasn't a command, but an invitation. That unsettled her more than harsh orders would have. Men in her life had always told her what to do, often with fists if she faltered. Caleb's quiet offering of choice was foreign to her. She nodded, slipping into the rhythm of kneading dough, grateful for the distraction. He worked outside, mending the fence, checking the barn. From time to time, she glimpsed him through the window, moving with that same quiet steadiness. As the hours passed, Eliza realized she wanted to know more about him. Who was this man who had bought her, yet treated her not as property but as a guest? That evening, as they sat at the table with bread and stew between them, she found the courage to ask. "You live here alone?" Caleb looked up, his spoon paused halfway. His gray eyes were unreadable. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set the spoon down gently. "I wasn't always alone." The silence that followed was heavy. Eliza lowered her gaze, afraid she had pried too deeply. But then his voice, low and rough, filled the space between them. "My wife and our boy. Fever took them near 8 years ago. After that, I came here. Easier to live with ghosts when there's no one around to remind you." The words cut through her, heavy with grief. She looked at him then, really looked. The lines in his face weren't only from wind and labor. They were carved by loss. The scars on his arms told one story, but the shadow in his eyes told another. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her throat tightening. He gave a small nod, as if the apology belonged to the world, not just her. Then he reached for his spoon again. Life has a way of taking, but sometimes it gives back too, in its own time. Eliza sat in silence, the words lodging deep inside her. She knew the sting of being cast aside, branded worthless. He knew the sting of love ripped away. Both of them carried scars no one could see, and though neither said it aloud, a fragile understanding grew between them across the table, that perhaps in this lonely cabin on the ridge, two broken souls might learn to piece together something whole. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Eliza had never known before. Not one of harsh orders or endless punishment, but of quiet tasks and small choices, choices that belonged to her. Caleb never told her what to do. Instead, he'd gesture to the garden or the barn and say things like, "If you feel up to it," or he'd leave a basket of mending near the fire and add, "Only if you want to keep your hands busy." It unsettled her at first. She wasn't used to being given options. In her father's house, everything had been demanded, and mistakes had been met with hard words or worse. But here, when she chose to knead bread or weed the rows of carrots, Caleb would nod once, sometimes with the faintest ghost of a smile. "Good work," he'd say, as though her effort mattered. Those two words meant more to her than any praise she had ever received in her life. Still, fear clung to her like a shadow. The first time she spilled flour across the table while baking, her hands flew instinctively to cover her face, bracing for a blow. Caleb froze at the doorway, startled not by the mess but by her reaction. His brow furrowed as he crouched beside her. "Eliza," he said softly, "things break flour spills. That's life." She dared to lower her hands. His voice carried no anger, only a calm certainty that made her chest ache. "You don't need to fear me," he added. "I won't raise a hand to you, not now. Not ever." The words struck her harder than any slap could have. She wanted to believe him, but belief was dangerous. It had failed her before. Yet the steadiness in his gaze, the absence of mockery or impatience, planted a fragile seed inside her heart. The next test came when Caleb saddled the chestnut mare one morning and held out the reins. "You should ride," he said. "Stretch her legs." "Stretch yours too." Eliza shook her head at once, backing away. I can't. I might fall. I'll only make a fool of myself." Caleb's mouth twitched in something close to a smile. "Then you'll fall, and you'll get back up again. That's the way of things." She wanted to refuse, to retreat into the safety of chores inside the cabin, but something in his tone nudged her forward. With trembling hands, she mounted the horse. The mare shifted beneath her, and panic surged through her chest. But Caleb walked beside her, one hand steady on the reins, his calm presence keeping her grounded. When she finally circled the clearing without slipping from the saddle, Caleb tipped his hat in quiet approval. "See? You can do more than you think." That night, when she lay beneath the quilt, Eliza turned those words over and over. "You can do more than you think." They lit a small fire inside her, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. But trust, once broken, is slow to mend. Some nights, she still dreamed of her father's sneer, the trader's rough grip, the saloon's cruel laughter. She would wake gasping, certain she was back in those places. Each time, she would find herself in Caleb's cabin instead, with the steady glow of the hearth and the mountain silence outside. And each time, she realized more clearly, he had not bought her to own her. He had brought her here to give her a life she had never been allowed to claim. Slowly, day by day, she began to trust, not fully, not yet, but enough to look him in the eye when he spoke. Enough to laugh, soft and uncertain, when he made a dry remark. Enough to start believing that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't worthless after all. By midsummer, Eliza's life on the ridge had begun to feel almost like a dream she was afraid to wake from. She rose each morning to the smell of pine-scented air instead of her father's scolding. She worked in the garden, kneaded bread, and even grew confident enough to ride the chestnut mare through the clearing without Caleb leading her. Each day brought some new piece of herself she hadn't known was there. Patience, laughter, even courage. But the mountain had a way of carrying whispers up from the valley, and shadows of her past were not so easily left behind. It began with a warning. Caleb returned one evening from the trading post in town with a grim set to his jaw. He placed the supplies on the table without a word, his silence heavier than stone. Eliza, sensing the shift, asked softly, "What is it?" He hesitated as though debating whether to burden her. Finally, he said, Word spread about the sale. Men down in town are still talking. One in particular, the prospector who bid on you that night. He's been asking questions. Eliza's stomach clenched, cold dread rising through her chest. She remembered the red-faced man, the leering smile, the way he had slapped the bar when he thought he'd bought her. Her hands shook as she pressed them to the table. What does he want? Caleb's eyes were steady, gray as storm clouds. To claim what he thinks is his. Men like that don't take kindly to being outbid. The following days were thick with unease. Caleb went about his work as usual, mending fences, cutting wood, but Eliza noticed the way he scanned the tree line more often, the rifle never far from reach. At night, he double-checked the door latch before dousing the lantern. One afternoon, while Eliza was gathering herbs near the edge of the clearing, she heard voices, male voices, rough and low, drifting up the trail. Her breath caught. She ducked behind a stand of trees, clutching her basket to her chest. The men came into view, 3 of them, strangers to her except for one. The prospector. His eyes were sharp with greed, his mouth twisted into a sneer. "I know she's up here," he said to the others. "Caleb can't keep her. She was bought, and what's bought belongs to whoever paid first." Eliza's blood ran cold. She crept back to the cabin as quietly as she could, heart pounding. Caleb was on the porch, sharpening a blade. At the sight of her pale face, he stood at once. "They're here," she whispered, clutching his sleeve. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Go inside. Lock the door." "No!" The word escaped before she could stop it. She didn't want to hide like a child while he faced danger alone. But his steady gaze silenced her protest. Reluctantly, she slipped inside, pressing her back to the door, listening. Moments later, the men's boots crunched in the clearing. The prospector's voice rang out. "Caleb! You've got something that ain't yours." Caleb answered from the porch, voice even, controlled. "She's not a thing to be owned. She's free here." A coarse laugh. "Free? She was bought. And I mean to collect." Through the crack in the shutters, Eliza saw Caleb standing tall, shoulders squared, his rifle at his side. The prospector stepped closer, fury in his eyes. For a tense moment, Eliza thought violence would break like thunder over the ridge. But Caleb didn't flinch. "You'll leave now," he said, his tone quiet as stone. "And you won't come back. If you do, you'll answer to me." The men grumbled, muttered threats. But the weight of Caleb's calm, unshaken presence seemed to press them back. At last, with curses and spit on the ground, they turned and stalked down the trail. Eliza sagged against the wall, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks. Caleb entered moments later, his face unreadable. "They'll be back," he said. "Men like that don't let go easy." For Eliza, the fear was suffocating. But beneath it burned something stronger, the fierce knowledge that she wasn't just running from her past anymore. She was standing beside someone willing to fight for her, and for the first time in her life, she thought, maybe she was worth fighting for. The days after the confrontation passed like waiting for a storm. Caleb went about his work with the same steady hands. But Eliza saw the subtle changes, the rifle propped by the door, the way his eyes scanned the tree line before letting the horses out, how he lingered near her when she worked outside. He said little, but the weight of unspoken worry filled the cabin. Eliza tried to hide her fear, but it lingered like smoke in her lungs. At night, she lay awake, listening to every rustle of wind, every creak of the cabin walls. She knew the prospector wouldn't forget, and men like him didn't forgive. Her fears proved right. It happened deep in the night, when the stars shone sharp as needles in the sky. Eliza woke to the acrid scent of smoke, her eyes flying open in alarm. At first she thought it was the hearth. But when she sat up, she saw the orange glow through the window, too bright, too wild. Caleb. She cried, scrambling from the bed. He was already awake, pulling on his boots, his face set with grim determination. "Stay inside," he ordered. But Eliza shook her head, fear tightening her chest. "No, I won't hide while you—" A loud crack outside cut her words short. She rushed to the door and flung it open despite his protest. Flames roared at the edge of the clearing. The barn was ablaze, fire eating through its walls like a living beast. Sparks leapt high into the night, carried by the wind toward the cabin itself. Caleb cursed under his breath and ran toward the blaze with a bucket. Eliza followed, her nightdress whipping in the wind, her bare feet sinking into the cold earth. Fear clawed at her, but something stronger pulled her forward, the determination not to cower this time, not to let fear define her. Together they formed a frantic rhythm. Caleb hauled water from the well, his muscles straining as he tossed it onto the fire. Eliza grabbed smaller buckets, dousing the edges of the flames, coughing as smoke burned her throat. The heat was unbearable, the crack of timbers collapsing louder than gunfire. "Back, Eliza!" Caleb shouted when a burning beam crashed down. But she refused to retreat, running instead to free the animals from the smaller pen beside the barn. The terrified horses screamed and kicked at the gate. With trembling hands, she fumbled with the latch, nearly blinded by smoke until it finally gave way. The horses bolted into the night, their hooves thundering against the earth. When she turned back, Caleb was there, soot streaked across his face, eyes blazing with something fiercer than the fire itself. "You could have been killed," he growled. "So could you," she shot back. Her voice ragged. For a heartbeat, they stood staring at one another through the haze, flames crackling around them, each seeing the other not as fragile or unworthy, but as strong, equals in the fight for survival. By dawn, the barn was gone, reduced to blackened beams and smoldering ash. Exhaustion weighed on them, but the animals were safe, the cabin still standing. They collapsed side by side on the ground, hands blistered, lungs aching. Eliza coughed, pressing her soot-stained hand to her chest. "They did this," she whispered. "The men," Caleb's jaw tightened. "Aye, and they'll answer for it." But when he looked at her, his expression softened. His hand, calloused and scarred, reached out and brushed her soot-marked cheek. "You stood beside me," he said quietly, almost in wonder. "Didn't run, didn't hide," Eliza's throat tightened. "I won't ever again." The fire had destroyed much, but it had forged something, too. Side by side in the ashes, Eliza realized she wasn't the frightened, worthless girl her father had sold. She was stronger now, strong enough to face fire, strong enough to fight for herself, strong enough to belong here with Caleb, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but pride. The fire had left scars across the ridge, blackened earth and ash where the barn once stood, but life pressed on. Caleb rebuilt slowly, methodically, his hands steady even as the loss weighed heavy. Eliza worked beside him, carrying timber, tending to the animals, and mending what she could. There was no hesitation in her anymore, no flinching, no doubt. Every day she felt herself growing into the rhythm of mountain life, her roots sinking deeper into the soil of this place. But the memory of the men lingered, like a wolf's shadow at the edge of camp. Eliza knew they hadn't gone for good. That knowledge settled over her heart, heavy as stone. She was no stranger to fear, but this time, something was different. She wasn't afraid for herself alone. She feared for Caleb, for the home they were building together, for the fragile but real bond that had formed between them. One evening, after a long day of labor, Caleb sat with her on the porch as the sun bled gold across the mountains. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his hair damp from washing off the soot and sweat. They shared a silence that felt heavier than usual, a silence charged with something unsaid. Eliza finally broke it, her voice soft but certain. "They'll come back, Caleb." He turned his gaze toward her, gray eyes unreadable. "I know." "Then we can't live like this," she pressed, twisting her hands in her lap. "Always waiting, always looking over our shoulders. I can't bear the thought of losing this, losing you, because of me." His brows furrowed, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "You think I'd trade your safety for peace?" "Eliza, listen to me. You are not a burden. You're not some curse I've taken on. You're everything I didn't know I needed." Her breath caught, his words stirring something deep in her chest. All her life she had been branded worthless, treated like a piece of property, sold away like unwanted livestock. And yet here was a man, scarred and solitary, who saw her not as a possession but as treasure. She swallowed hard, gathering courage she didn't know she had. "Then let me choose, Caleb. Let me stand with you. If danger comes, I won't hide behind you. I can't live like the girl they told me I was anymore." I want to be the woman you believe I am. His hand closed over hers, rough and warm, grounding her. For a long moment, he said nothing, just searched her face as though he could read every secret thought. Then, slowly, a faint smile curved his lips. "You've got more fire in you than you realize," he murmured. "Maybe more than me." Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. "That fire's because of you. You gave me a chance to see it." Caleb leaned closer, the weight of unspoken feelings pressing in around them. The world seemed to still, the crickets, the breeze, the very earth, waiting. And then, for the first time, his lips brushed hers. It was not hurried, not desperate, but steady and certain, as if sealing a vow neither had dared to speak aloud. When they parted, Eliza rested her forehead against his chest, her heart thundering. "I choose you," she whispered, voice trembling with conviction. "No matter what comes, I choose this life, this place, you." Caleb's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. "And I'll spend my life proving you're worth every choice I make." The night deepened around them, but inside Eliza, something glowed bright. Love wasn't just a tender feeling. It was a decision, a choice to stay, to fight, to build something new from ashes. And she had chosen. For the first time in her life, it wasn't someone else deciding her fate. It was her. The air on the ridge grew cooler with autumn, the leaves painted in reds and golds, a reminder that seasons turned no matter the hardships endured. Eliza had grown stronger in body and spirit. Her hands, once soft and timid, bore the marks of work, small calluses, faint scars from tending to animals and gardens. Yet when Caleb looked at her, he never saw weariness. He saw a woman who had endured more than most and risen, radiant and unbroken. But peace was fragile. The prospector and his men had not returned since the fire, yet both Caleb and Eliza knew it was only a matter of time. They had tasted his malice, and men like that did not forget slights. Each crack of a branch in the woods set Eliza's heart racing, though she tried not to show it. The reckoning came on a night when the moon hung thin and sharp in the sky. Caleb had been repairing the barn's frame while Eliza cooked stew inside. The knock at the cabin door was no gentle visitor's tap. It was a pounding demand. Caleb's rifle was in his hand before the second strike. "Stay back," he whispered to Eliza, but she did not retreat. This time she would not cower. When Caleb opened the door, the prospector stood there, two men flanking him, their faces twisted with drink and greed. "Step aside," the man snarled. "She's mine. Always was. Paid for her fair and square. You can keep your land, your animals, hell, keep your pride. But the girl comes with me." Eliza stepped forward before Caleb could speak, her voice clear and steady. "I am not yours." "I never was." The prospector laughed, a cruel sound. "A girl like you doesn't get to decide." "Men do." He shoved forward, but Caleb barred his way. The barrel of the rifle angled low but ready. "You heard her," Caleb said, his voice iron. "You won't lay a hand on her." The tension stretched taut, the night alive with danger. One of the men sneered, reaching for his belt knife. But before blood could spill, Eliza moved. She lifted the heavy iron skillet from the stove. Her hands steady, her heart fierce, and slammed it onto the table with a crash that startled the men into stillness. "You want to take me?" she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to shake the walls. "Then you'll have to face me, not just him. I am not a thing to be owned. Not by my father. Not by you. Not by anyone." The prospector's face twisted, fury warring with disbelief. For a heartbeat, silence filled the cabin, broken only by the hiss of stew boiling over. Then Caleb stepped forward, rifle raised, his stance unyielding. "Leave," he said, "or I'll bury you here where the mountain won't even remember your names." Something in his voice, calm, deadly certain, broke through the bravado. The men muttered curses but began to retreat, dragging the prospector with them as he spat threats over his shoulder. "This ain't over," he roared, but his footsteps crunched down the trail until the night swallowed them whole. When the door shut, Eliza sagged, her knees weak. Caleb set the rifle aside and caught her in his arms, holding her as though he would never let go. "You were brave," he whispered, his lips brushing her hair. Braver than anyone I've ever known. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were not of fear. They were of release. For the first time in her life, she had spoken for herself, claimed her worth with her own voice. And Caleb had stood with her, not as her master or savior, but as her partner. In the days that followed, they rebuilt again. The barn rose anew, stronger than before, with beams Caleb cut by hand and Eliza helped lift into place. The valley folk began to see her not as a girl sold off, but as a woman who had chosen her place and fought for it. Winter came, and with it, the quiet peace of snow settling on the ridge. Caleb and Eliza stood at the doorway one evening, watching the world turn white. He took her hand, rough fingers entwining with hers. "This is our life now," he said softly. "Not given, not taken, built." Eliza leaned against him, her heart full. She had been branded worthless once, cast aside as though her life had no meaning. But here on this mountain, with this man, she had been seen, cherished, and treasured. Her past had tried to define her, but her future was her own, born from fire, forged in love.